Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another Big Data London webinar. Today, we're looking about how to balance data accessibility while maintaining privacy. That's easy for me to say, obviously, there. So I'm Andy Steed. I'm Content Director of Big Data London, and today I'm joined by Niamh O'Brien from Fivetran. Hi, Niamh.
Hi, Andy. Good to be here. Nice to meet you all.
Obviously, these sessions are designed to be interactive, so please ask as many questions as you like using the question box at the bottom of the screen. We'll endeavour to ask as many as we can to Niamh at the end of her session, where we've got a little bit of time designated for questions. There's going to be couple of polls during the presentation, so look out for them. You'll be able to click them again underneath your screen. If there's any problem with the feed at all, there shouldn't be, but just in case, tap refresh in the browser, you'll just jump straight back into where you left it. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to our featured presenter today. Over to you, Niamh.
Thanks, Andy. Let me get the presentation up and running here. Great. So, Andy's just done a great intro of the topic, so I'll just move on here and intro myself. So, as Andy said, Niamh O'Brien. You might tell from the Irish accent that I am indeed from Ireland, and the difficult name spelling versus pronunciation, which I usually get. So apologies about that in advance. But as Andy said, I work for Fivetran. I manage one of the solution architect teams at Fivetran. So that's one of our technical teams that works post-sales with our customers, advising on their whole entire modern data stack in terms of best practices and how to get the most out of that modern data stack to drive the business outcomes that they want as customers. Just a bit about me in terms of my background. So I started off in SAP back in the day, and then moved on into consulting. So went into data and analytics consulting and pretty much fulfilled, I think, every kind of data role that exists out there. I know there's a lot of debate about data analyst versus data engineer versus data scientists these days, but I think I pretty much fulfilled most of those over my time in consulting. And so I worked with Accenture and KPMG, and I led the data engineering team in KPMG. And then really I came to Fivetran just last year. And I think probably go into a bit of the motivation around why I joined Fivetran and what Fivetran is about a bit more later on. But really briefly, Fivetran is a data movement tool. We move data from multiple different data sources into cloud data warehouses so that you can centralize that data and really drive value from the fact that you're able to actually join those various data sources together. As I said, my background is all in data analytics and data science, and I was just finding that as a data scientist, I was actually spending most of my time trying to just literally get access to data and get it into a central location. So when I actually came across Fivetran, I definitely saw that I was solving that pain and really wanted to move into a company that was doing that, because I could see that was kind of a ubiquitous problem across the data industry. So that's a bit about me and my background and why I'm here today. So what are we going to discuss really? And sometimes I don't actually like having agenda slides for these kind of discussions, because it's kind of nice to go through the presentation, and then as it evolves, you kind of find out where we're going to go with this discussion. But at a very high level, why data democratization exists, what is the reasoning for it, motivation behind it, the concept of it, how has it evolved over time, what role does data governance play in this, and where does data democratization and also data governance fit in the modern data stack? And then I'm looking forward to leaving quite a bit of time for Q&A or just general thoughts about the topics as well. So without further ado, we did mention that there would be a quick poll. Look, this is just to get some engagement on this. I think I have some data about being data driven, and what I think that means, and whether this goal of being data driven is maybe as ubiquitous as it seems in the data industry. So there should be a poll popping up on your screen, and you should be able to answer that now. I'm not going to wait for the answer right now. We can probably come back to it in the next slide. So hopefully you're answering that poll, and to be honest, hopefully it's kind of correlating what we're seeing in this graph. So, you know, why data democratization exists? Well, you know, data can tell many different stories. I actually just created this graph using Google Ngram, if anybody's ever come across that. Basically, it tracks the number of or the popularity of particular terms throughout general books and literature over time. So you can see here that, you know, the phrase data-driven has obviously increased in popularity. We had a bit of a plateau there around 1995, and maybe that's actually when we see this data democratization term start to come to the fore. I mean, one of the interpretations of this graph could be that, you know, we have this increase in you know, the use of the term data driven in our literature and our studies around the 1990s, which makes sense. I mean, it's the database era, it's the CRM era. We have, as is mentioned, you know, huge companies like SAP coming out, and, you know, data has become less of, you know, a byproduct and more of, you know, an asset that people are starting to use as part of running their business on a daily basis. But, you know, we have this plateau, and maybe people are like, okay, well, we want to be data driven, but what does that actually mean? And, you know, therein might be the kind of genesis of data democratization as a term and as a concept. And because I think people started to realize, or the industry as a whole started to realize, that if you want to be data driven, you have to democratize data access and access to the right people at the right time. So really, it was just to see that poll, which I see the results have just come in. 100% of people who've answered have said that it is one of the goals of your organization. So thankfully, it is kind of correlating what we've seen in this graph, because otherwise we would have had to do a bit of a different piece of analysis. But I'm not surprised by these results. Look, it's just a poll that I wanted to see and was curious to see in this group. And it does, you know, it's obvious, you know, people want to be data driven, no, not entirely driven by data, which we'll get into later on in the slides, but it's something that makes perfect sense. And, you know, looking at the trends in that space is quite interesting. What is also interesting is actually when you talk to people about being data driven, and, you know, I often ask customers or, you know, stakeholders that I'm working with is, you know, do you consider yourself a data-driven organization? And sometimes people say yes without hesitation. And usually if there's very little hesitation, I kind of drill into it a little bit more, because there aren't too many companies that I've come across that are genuinely data-driven. And I usually go through this data maturity curve with customers or stakeholders to actually, you know, tell them what would actually be defined as data driven. So, you know, starting on the left hand side, obviously most people won't fit into this category. So inactive, you know, decisions are made on best guess and experience. Obviously there should, you know, be an element of that in your decision making, but not the only element of your decision making. Then we move on to, you know, if you're at the stage where you're data aware, right? So you're looking at data to review past events. You know, you have reports, you have dashboards where, you know, you're looking at, okay, well, you know, what were my sales in the last week, the last month, and trying to understand why something might have happened, understand that data, and then maybe try to use that to influence what you might do next month, for example. So you're aware of data, you're using it, but it's mostly kind of on a look back on a historical basis. Then we have companies that are kind of data influenced. So data is available. It's not just, you know, look back data. You're not just looking at it from a weekly, monthly, quarterly reporting. You're actually looking at it that much more frequently. You're kind of assessing it daily. A lot of your higher level decisions are made using data, or maybe like your leadership team are using data for a lot of their decisions. And maybe you're also, in some instances or some areas of the business, you're using data for more predictive analytics. And then finally, being truly data driven is that, data is available, in or near real time, or as I kind of like to talk about it a bit more, data is available when you need it. So when you're going to do that self-serve analytics, or when you're going to look at the data to make a decision that you need to make, that data is available, it's up to date, and it's fresh for you to make that. If you're a truly data-driven company, data is basically essential to your daily operational decisions. So, what this looks like is, if you're, say, in sales and you're a sales rep, and instead of just, looking at your calendar and, going to the meetings that you're supposed to be in every day, and maybe you look at the end of the day, you look at your numbers from that day, or the end of the week, you look at your numbers from that week. When we're talking about being data driven, we're talking about that sales rep actually before the meeting going and looking at some data to assess, well, how am I actually going to run this meeting? And, did I prep for this meeting a week ago? And has anything in the data that I have available to me changed within that week that will actually change how I action this meeting or how I approach this meeting? So that's what I mean by truly data driven, is that you're actually using data on a regular basis for your operational decisions, or to influence how you actually approach your tasks on a daily basis. And also, to be data driven is in an organization, it needs to not just be, your leadership team or your executive team really drilling into, data points and using that to make decisions. It really needs to be across, all of your organizations, right down to that individual contributor and how they're structuring their decisions or their daily actions based on data. And then finally, leveraging data for, that more predictive analytics and machine learning analytics will make your data-driven decisions, I suppose, more efficient. Also, if you're using, machine learning models, you're actually taking, the experience that you embedded into your historical decisions that you might have said, I used that decision, I made that decision based on some data, but also based on my experience in this particular industry. Obviously, with machine learning models, if you use the historical look back, you're looking at that historical data. And what basically your machine learning model is doing is taking, understanding the trends that you used to make that call. So you're basically embedding the experience of your previous decisions into your future decisions. And that's really when you can start to be truly data driven. So usually when I ask customers if they're data driven, I ask them before I show them, we walk through this data maturity curve. And then I also like to ask them after, and then try to understand where actually they sit on this curve. So I think we have another poll on that. Would be really curious to know within this group what kind of where people feel their organizations are at. So the poll should be coming up, but the four answers should be either inactive, which I don't expect many people will be, data aware, data influenced, and data driven. So we'll come back to this. I'll give you a few minutes to actually answer your poll, and then we'll jump back in. So becoming data driven, how do you actually get there, and what are the kind of key pillars? So I mentioned it just in the previous slide, but just to kind of zone in on this, because, being data driven is really what's driving this increase in the concept of data democratization, and people saying, okay, we need to democratize this data because we want to be data driven. So how do you actually do that? The first thing I mentioned was data access and availability, and that being timely. That word is really important. So, the modern data stack as a whole, so your cloud data warehouse, your data integration tools that are keeping that data up to date and fresh and consistent, And then finally, your transformation layer with maybe like your DBT, and then your BI layer with, your Looker, your Tableau, et cetera. That modern data stack has really being, brought that timely data availability to life. So that's really started to give, organizations the foundation to actually become data driven. So that key pillar is really, obviously, I wouldn't like to say solved. I think the modern data stack and every organization's journey to that is always, you start off, but you're always, improving that modern data stack and adding more to it and more data to it as you go on. So that's something that's, available. And I think that pillar of becoming data driven is close to being, I suppose, solved by some of the modern technologies that have come out in recent times. The predictive analytics part of becoming data driven is definitely not solved. I kind of mentioned at the top of the call my own experience of being in the data science industry and building models, data models that just never made it into production. There's a lot of different reasons for that. Down to like data quality, lack of data governance, just people not being overly familiar with data science and how it works, et cetera. So I don't think we've really cracked that nut yet as a data industry. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that pillar, because I do actually think you can call yourself a data-driven company without having any predictive analytics as of yet. The reason I say that is because if I go back to that example of, a sales rep of, going and using that data prior to a meeting to inform how they might run that meeting, that doesn't need data science. To be data driven, as I said, my key focus with customers is using those decisions across the company to make those operational decisions. Using data across the company to make those operational decisions. What predictive analytics does is basically make your data-driven decisioning more efficient. And obviously, you have that future look as well. So, you can argue that your decisions will be better if they're also informed by a predictive nature, which I totally agree with. I don't think we're quite there yet in the industry. And I know there's obviously tools and technologies coming out to kind of help progress data science and actually having it less as, something that we just do in silos or do as, proof of concepts, but actually getting it into production. And, part of the modern data stack, just to go back to that, is obviously to, create that centralized data view that's robust, controlled, governed, which will actually in turn make your machine learning models, perform on robust data, which in turn will make them more likely to actually be moved into production. So I think the modern data stack will also help with this statistic. So 87% of machine learning projects don't make it into production, but it's not the focus of today, because as I say, I do believe that you can be data driven without necessarily having the most advanced machine learning models available. So what we're really going to focus on today is this operational decisioning, and in particular data democratization. The other phrase you'll hear a lot obviously is self-serve analytics, and I think the two kind of go hand in hand. So let's kind of dive into that, or double click into that a bit more. So we talked about why data democratization exists. I think it exists for many reasons. I do believe it is driven a lot by the movement to be data driven, but I thought it would just be interesting to look at kind of the evolution of it. That graph that I showed you previously, the Ngram graph, actually only goes up to 2019, because that's the only data we have available for that. But I would be curious if it did go beyond 2019 up to current time, what it would look like, or if it would be any different. Because you'll see in this timeline view that, we started off, the database era, and that's probably when in that graph we could kind of see an uptick in the phrase data democratization. So 1990 to 2010, and then really in 2013 when AWS Redshift was released, that was the start of cloud data warehousing as we know, and really the start of the concept, I suppose, of the modern data stack. And that's when data at scale became possible. So we had that line in the graph where we had that kind of stagnant reference to being data driven, and then we could kind of see as it was going through the mid 2000s, that line started to increase. And that is probably been affected by the fact that we now had cloud technologies that could actually handle the scale of data that we wanted to analyze, and also handle all of the various access and controls, and give a centralized view where people could actually look at the data and start to genuinely be more data driven. Previously, if the data was just in one system, if you didn't have access to that system, how were you going to actually analyze that data? And a lot of those systems weren't optimized for analyzing data as well. So really the birth of the cloud data warehouse really allowed access to data to come to the fore, and people to start talking about being data driven again. And then we had, I don't think the big data movement is something that we can really define. I just know, having obviously been in consulting in this period of time, big data was the big buzzword. I think we've moved on from big data to fast data, or the right data at the right time, which can only be a good thing. But there was a big focus on big data, getting all the volumes in, and focusing on giving access to that data. And that's what we saw in that graph, right? So data democratization as a term started to increase in popularity. I actually just included this screenshot, which I thought was pretty interesting. This is what happens when you Google data democratization. It's all about access to data. So you can see underlined there in the results. So making it accessible, access to data, making data accessible. And this is really, how people kind of defined data democratization in 2017, which is pretty interesting given on what I think the current definition of it is. Because what happened in 2018 and 2020 is that GDPR actually came into effect in the EU, and it's kind of, it feels like it's been around for longer than that, or it certainly feels like it to me anyway. I feel like I've been talking about it for a very long time. And also we had the CCPA in 2020 come into effect in California as well. And then we had, instances like Facebook and Google CEOs testifying about privacy in front of Congress. So we kind of had this period of like 2013 to 2017. It was all about data access, big data, getting data, to everyone, to everywhere. And then in 2018, 2020, we kind of start to have more regulation around data and access, and what it can be used for. And that's kind of only really continued as well in recent times. So in 2021, when Apple announced their requirements for opt-in, as opposed to opt out of tracking and everything around marketing and cookies, etc., they really started to kind of progress the idea that privacy as a USP. And so they started to talk about privacy as kind of like a competitive advantage, right? To having Apple and being an Apple user. You might look at that and say, if you look at the revenue distribution of Apple, you'll actually see that most of their revenue comes from their devices. Whereas if you look at the revenue of, your Google or your Facebook, the vast majority of their revenue comes from marketing. So you can say that, as well as Apple coming out and saying, we really want to support privacy. Obviously, it's not actually a major impact to their book of business, so to speak, to kind of be on the forefront of that. So it is pretty interesting from an industry perspective that they've gone that way. I think it makes a lot of sense. But it has kind of resulted in a shift to how we generally think and talk about data access. And And I think where we're at today is data democratization, but within asterisks. So I've just added that asterisk there because I think even, if you look back at that definition, so to speak, of data democratization that we saw when you just Google it, it was just about access, and there was no mention of the right level of access or the literacy needed to kind of understand that data. It was just access kind of for everyone, for everyone whenever they wanted it, and we didn't really understand how to actually implement data democratization. So I think today, it's something that we our leaders and CDOs and general data practitioners have obviously become acutely aware of. We talk about data democratization, but I think in a more controlled and more tightly defined definition of data democratization. And this is the one that I kind of like to use myself. I'm sure it exists out there somewhere in the internet ether. I actually just wrote it like this myself on the slide. But for me, it is about having a data literate workforce with the right access to the right data. So instead of all access to all data, it's really about understanding, what access that particular member of your team or your organization needs and what data they need access to, and making that like streamlined and efficient as possible, and building a framework around that will actually support it. It's not that data democratization can't happen or it shouldn't happen, or because of everything that's happened around GDPR and compliance, etc., that we should give up on data democratization as a whole. We know still from the start, if we go back to the start of the presentation, that we all do want to be data driven. It's a goal of many, many organizations. And to be able to be data driven, we know we need to get access to data across all of our workforce. And they need to be able to use that data as and when they need it. And they need to be able to self-serve use that data so that they can actually get the answers that they need in near real time. So that kind of tees us up really to talk about the main topic for today, which is how do you actually balance that accessibility while kind of maintaining privacy or maintaining some kind of level of control. And really the answer is by leveraging a lot of data governance or data management tools or frameworks that exist out there. And I still think for a lot of people, data governance is kind of the antithesis of data democratization. There's still the notion that data governance is really about, rules and, actually locking down access and denying access and red tape. And it's seen as in this very kind of compliance focused mindset. So let's kind of explore that a bit before we get into kind of how we might actually leverage data governance. This is a definition of data governance from a data analytics perspective from Gartner. So it says it's the specification of decision rights and accountability framework to ensure appropriate behavior in the valuation, creation, and consumption and control of data analytics. So a very true definition of data governance if there ever existed, and it's completely accurate, and I do agree with it. The problem with, I suppose, definitions is that this definition doesn't actually talk too much to the value that data creates. It's all about ensuring appropriate behavior and control. It doesn't really talk about, well, if you actually enable someone with the right level of access, you can actually give them more control. And if you manage your data appropriately, you can actually give more people access to that data because maybe, for example, you've actually hashed or blocked any of that personal identifiable data that was in that data set. So it's now safe for many, many more users to use it, as opposed to, keeping that data as it is, not having, any kind of data governance framework or strategy around that data, and then having to lock that data down and not give anyone access to it. So it's the right definition. But I think in general, we need to move from a compliance-driven mindset around data governance to a value-driven mindset. So, data governance has long been seen as a framework for compliance, really. The problem with this is that kind of command and control approach to governance just creates barriers between people and data. And that's, I think, why people think that data governance can be like the antithesis of data democratization and data access. Because we've only really dug into the compliance part of data governance and, not the, let's say, data observability part of data governance. And the main impact of having poor data governance previously was basically having to pay fines. Now, companies like Apple, as I just mentioned before, are actually starting to use data governance, as a competitive advantage. And so the primary impact of not adopting a data governance plan might actually be that you're being outpaced by your competitors. So it's no longer, just something that you deal with at the end of the year, you get fines. It's that you won't actually be able to operate efficiently as an organization without this. It's become completely necessary to kind of do anything data related. So when we talk about a value-driven mindset, what I really love is this idea of control without constraint. So this is ensuring your team has access to everything that they need and nothing that they don't, in order to obviously protect data, because we know that data privacy is obviously super important. We have those regulations for a reason. The focus on data privacy in recent years and has been great for every end user out there, and highly valued, I think. But you can give control without constraint. So what does that look like? Maybe, for example, in your cloud data warehouse provider, you have just a sandbox environment, and you can kind of give, pretty much everyone that you would want, maybe on your data team, access to that. Now that they have that environment, they can go and self-serve any projects that they want to do within that environment. So they don't have any constraints within that environment, but you have control in that, they're only going to be accessing that sandbox, and then, your production flows aren't going to be impacted by what they might be doing in that sandbox. So control without constraint is a really key concept to get across in terms of your data governance strategy. Kind of touched on it a bit earlier, but seeing the value of data governance, and I think this is coming to the fore now in the industry, given the number of startups or scale-ups that we see in the data management space or the data governance space, because it can really add a lot of value, because it can broaden your visibility or your observability of your data, where it's moving, who's moving it, how it's changing. And, all of that metadata about your data can actually be incredibly useful to your employees. So, now that employees can actually, find their data, so do effective data discovery, for example, they might actually be more likely to use that data. So it is really critical, if you're trying to be that, data-driven company, is that your employees, as part of your organization, are actually able to find the data that they might need to make a decision. If you put up a barrier to finding that data, they're not going to be able to go completely out of their way to go and find that data. You should be trying to make that data discoverable and accessible to them as and when they need it, and then they will truly become more data driven. And also, having the visibility of what data exists out there, they can find data that they didn't even necessarily know existed and start using that in a self-serve manner, instead of you having to be very prescriptive about, this is the data that you should be using. We built these particular dashboards, and you need to you look at those dashboards for your use case. Giving employees the ability to actually self-serve the analytics that they feel they need, or self-serve and find the answers that they need from the data, will be hugely beneficial to your company and or your organization, and will actually allow you to be a bit more data driven. And as I said, it's not a case of we don't adopt, or we don't put time or resources or investment into our data governance strategy, and the end result is that we won't we'll have to pay some fines. It's now becoming something that's fundamental to running your business. So through 2025, 80% of organizations seeking to scale businesses will actually fail because they don't have a modern approach to data and analytics governance. And maybe you've always had a data governance framework, and that's worked well for your compliance use case. But do you have a data governance framework that's supporting your data democratization within your company? Do you have data governance tools or data management tools that actually support data observability or metadata management? Because these are the areas of governance that are going to be super, super important for you in the next couple of years, and to actually ensure that your organizations can successfully scale to the goals that they want to get to. So data governance and data democratization, you might think I might have misunderstood what a symbiotic relationship is, because we've basically spent most of the time talking about how to have effective data democratization, it actually kind of has a dependency on having a robust and value-driven governance framework, which is totally true. We've just been through the reasons for that. But data governance, in turn, I would say it does have a dependency on data democratization, because the reason that data governance is difficult to kind of adopt, or the reason why maybe it hasn't been as invested in as it should have been in recent years, is actually because people have struggled to attach value to data governance. As I said, coming from that compliance mindset, you're not going to see a huge amount of value if you're just saying we need to do data governance because I don't want to pay this fine at the end of the year. Instead, if you can tie data governance to your data democratization or your data driven strategy, then the business understand, okay, this is tied directly to business value, and therefore you will get a lot more buy-in into data governance and your strategy around that. And that's why I say it has a symbiotic relationship. I think you need to really leverage the fact that you can drive value with your data governance strategy. And obviously you'll know from the previous statistic that if you don't do it, you won't be able to scale effectively. And there's only going to be more regulations and more privacy concerns as we move through the next number of years, not less. So being on top of that and being ahead of what those changes might look like, and having a sensible data governance framework within your organization is going to set you up for success in relation to that. So data democratization and governance in the modern data stack. So I've mentioned the modern data stack previously in this presentation, and I debate a lot with different people about where governance should fit in the modern data stack, at which point it should fit. And I think I'm going to give you my view on it today, but I'm happy to have questions on it later. I am going to use a Fivetran branded modern data stack slide, if that's okay. But basically what we have here is the modern data stack. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with it. On the left-hand side, you have your various data sources, and then you have a destination, which would be, let's say, your cloud data warehouse. And then on the right-hand side, obviously, you have your analytics, your data science, your use cases that are pulling from that data, and maybe you're running transformations on that, etc. So where in this kind of and you know, this is a simplified version, like maybe you have, you know, your reverse ETL and that's going back into your source, etc. But for the purposes of today, I suppose, where in this modern data stack, you know, should you be doing governance? Well, I mean, ultimately, you know, governance and should sit across everything that, you know, is to do with data in your organization. And, you know, you should have observability of each of these components of your data stack. So I'll say that at the start. But in terms of some specific examples, you know, some people would argue that, you know, your data governance, let's say your labeling of your data. So whether it's, you know, very sensitive data, or sensitive for some people data, or having various data labels attached to your data should live in your data warehouse. My own personal view is that I would prefer to have my governance as early as possible in the data lifecycle journey. So if I have, you know, a piece of PII data, say let's say in my Salesforce, and you know, if I'm not going to use that for analytics, which I'm probably not, I would just like to block that before it even gets it to my destination. To be honest, I would like to either block that completely, or if I want to use it for analytics, maybe I hash that data, and therefore I'm still actually able to use it for some analytics use cases. So I do like to start with keeping PII data in particular in the source, because it has to be in the source, right? That's where you're collecting the information. You need to have, you know, email addresses for your customers, etc. So that information needs to be in Salesforce. Does that information actually need to be in your destination? Probably not. So why wouldn't you, you know, hash or block that information before it even gets to your destination? Because then you don't need to worry about, you know, having specific data retention policies for that type of data. You know, you'll have your standard maybe data retention policies in general for data that lands in your destination, but you won't have to have a complex matrix of, you know, data retention policies based on different types of data if you're just blocking and anonymizing that sensitive data before it even gets to your destination. It also can make your access and controls that you need to give to your users a bit more straightforward. So if you know, for example, you know, actually that data doesn't contain any PII data, therefore you can just give, as I said, many people in your data team access to that particular part of, you know, your cloud data warehouse, because you know you're blocking that data at source. And therefore, you know, again, you don't have to necessarily have a complex matrix of access roles and requirements in that data source, because you've already kind of removed that PII data at source. So just to explain a little bit about Fivetran, it'd be terrible to have a slide here and me not talk through it. And I think just very briefly where we sit in the stack. So as I said, we have all of these different data connectors that we've built, over 180 different connectors. What we do is move that data securely, reliably, in an automated way into your data warehouse. We don't just move the data, we do it intelligently. So we don't just, you know, move full data set every single day or every single time you want to sync data. We actually only look at the rows that have changed. We do log-based change data capture to understand what rows have changed in your data sources, and only move those rows that have changed, and do upserts or inserts into your cloud data warehouse so that you have clean, structured data. So you can sync that data up to every 5 minutes, or in some cases you can actually sync it up to 1 minute. So we kind of have a micro batching architecture. The other thing we do is handle like automatic schema migration. So if you change something in your source, a column in your source, then we will automatically propagate that change into your destination without any manual intervention needed from your side. And we do it all extremely securely. It's all encrypted at transit and at rest. And we'll get into a bit about that as well, because kind of talked a lot about governance today and how it can really help your data democratization strategy. So I would like to kind of touch a bit on, you know, what Fivetran is trying to do to help in this space. So talked a lot about, personal PII data, because it comes up an awful lot with customers, and throughout my consulting career it was always a major concern. So what Fivetran has is that blocking that I mentioned at source. So when you go to set up a data connector with Fivetran, you can actually say, I don't want to move that particular column. And you can either block that column, or you can block a whole table, you can block a whole schema, or you can actually hash that data before it even arrives into your destination. We don't persist any data, so it's purged as soon as we successfully write it to your data, or to whatever destination you might have. And we provide transparency and auditability. So that's going back to that observability point I was making previously. So you have full control over your data access and detail logging over how data is handled and by whom. We're just about to release a metadata API, which will allow you to see, which columns are in your source, which columns are in your destination. And that metadata API, the plan is to integrate that with tools like Calibra and Elation, so that you're probably already using these tools for other areas of your technology stack. So Fivetran can be helpful to you by providing the information that we have, or the metadata that we have about that data being moved to those tools, so that you have that full end-to-end view and that data observability. And then control I talked about a lot. So control without constraint. So what we have in Fivetran is very, very granular role-based access control. So what that actually means is, instead of, we can grant access on many, many levels. So you could grant someone access to look at, all of the connectors, all of the data sources, or the data connectors, as we call them in Fivetran, within your account if you are using Fivetran. But you can also only, you can give access to literally just one connector. And so we give super granular control, or else you can give someone access to an entire part of your destination. So I mentioned earlier about, giving your data team access to a sandbox. So, you could have a dev destination or part of your warehouse within Fivetran that would just be given to, the vast majority of your data team for testing. And so you can just give them that destination level control, and then have some of your users having the prod level access. And then we also have role-based access control and provisioning via SSO providers. So if you're using the likes of Okta to manage all of your other users and access and permissioning, then you can also integrate with Fivetran to actually grant that user access via Okta as well. So that means, you have an employee, as you know, the Okta use case, that's using multiple different tools. One of those tools might be Fivetran. When they leave the company in Okta, you'll just remove them, and then their access will be removed from Fivetran as well. So data governance and data security in general is a really big focus for Fivetran, as well as the motivation that I talked about previously, about a reason as to why I joined Fivetran. I also joined because I could see they're very serious about data governance and security. Like, we have the most compliance certifications of any ELT cloud provider. And, data governance is obviously something that we think is very important. We do think it does drive data-driven companies and data-driven strategies. But we want to be a good partner in the modern data stack. And that's, as I touched on, that metadata API, and providing that insight and that data into, what's happening at the Fivetran piece, is really important that we do that, because we do believe data governance is important. And that's why we decided to kind of integrate with these other data governance tools to kind of provide a clearer picture for everyone, because obviously it's key to every organization going forward. So, Andy, I think I was a little bit longer than I said I would be. But yeah, curious to see if we have any questions. I would just like to give, before I go into questions, Andy, I might just give the results of the second poll that we did. So 5% said data driven, 52, so almost half, said data influenced, and 40% said data aware. I definitely should have had that poll at the start and then after I'd done the slide to see the difference. But I didn't want to go poll overload. But that is interesting to see.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. And that gave me a chance to remember to turn my mute off as well. So excellent. So it's seamless here. So yeah, actually, I was going to ask a question about the poll straight away. My question's a simple one, really. Is that kind of what you were expecting? A, and B, if you'd done this poll, let's go 5 years ago, do you think you would have got the same results, or do you think it would have been staggered one way or the other?
I think if I'd done the poll 5 years ago, I think there would be answers that said inactive. We got 0% inactive today. I think, to be fair, that 38% saying they're data aware is a lot higher than it would be previously. So I think in terms of now versus 5 years ago, I think that would be the biggest difference. I see more people must be answering because the stats are changing live here, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, that is roughly what I was expecting. I do think we've gone up to 11% data driven. I do think there are companies that are genuinely, focused on being data driven. And as I said, like the data science piece is part of it, and it is great to have, but it's not, for me, it's not mandatory to the definition of data driven. So I think around 10% of what I guess is a very data informed audience here today is probably quite accurate, to be honest.
Cool. Well, that's good. I was going to ask a question as well, based on something you mentioned a couple of times, and based on the fact that we're doing a webinar in a few weeks about data observability. For anyone who isn't sure specifically what data observability is, how would you sort of define it? And different to, because there's been a lot of talk about data observability recently. So what practices does make it data observability rather than just monitoring or keeping an eye on things?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I kind of I think there's a lot of people in the industry who want that to be a term. It's kind of like, the term like data lakehouse. We want data lakehouse to be a thing. So let's start using that term. And I think it's similar with data observability. And it is exactly what you talked about there, Andy. Like it's just a nice kind of understandable term to talk about, providing that metadata, providing that logging, and providing that insight. It's kind of the opposite of black box. People want to know what's going on, and that is honestly why, another reason why, machine learning models can struggle, because people just see them as a black box and they don't have that observability into what's actually going on behind the scenes. So it's really, that's how I think about observability, is really just opening it up and providing that level of metadata, so that you're actually able to understand what's happening. And then the other piece is what I talked about, is around that discoverability piece. So, your ability as an employee to observe what data exists in your organization. You need to have a really clear data catalog that's searchable, and you can discover data assets in that. So that's kind of some of the other core key components. But I'm glad you said it. I mean, you could have a whole webinar on data observability, which you're obviously doing. So I'm sure they'll give a lot better of an answer on that. But my answer as a general architect across the whole stack would be that.
Perfect. And sort of, sorry to keep putting you on the spot for definitions of things, but I was going to ask you more about the sort of data literacy piece. Sort of could you just explain a little bit more about the importance of that in this context, and ways that people can improve data literacy should they feel it's not where it should be in their company? Yes,
definitely. And, I kind of had it in this slides and didn't have it in this slides, and, went back and forth on it. And, I'm glad I didn't, given I wanted to leave time for questions. But like it goes without saying that data literacy is part of a huge part of being data driven, and huge part of that data democratization. I mentioned it in my definition of data democratization, and that's because you can have data there and available, and you can have machine learning models running out predictions, but if nobody is looking at them, knows where they are, or can understand them, obviously they're totally invaluable, right? So the reason why I didn't include it or talk too much about it is that sometimes people, I find, get really, really focused on data literacy before they actually have sorted out their framework for access. Because for me, the most powerful way to run a data literacy workshop or session or training is to actually show people your own data and show them data that they can actually play around with, show them data that they could actually use tomorrow after that training. And sometimes we do data literacy training and it's on some random data set, and that's just not as powerful or as impactful. So today I really wanted to focus on getting a framework getting a framework that will actually support getting access, the right data access to the right people. And then once you have that, that is the most powerful time to actually do that data literacy training, and then they can go away tomorrow and start actually using that to make their decisions. So that's why I didn't necessarily focus too much on it today, because I think there's some prerequisites that we need to get to before we can go to data literacy training, so to speak.
Perfect. Well, before we wrap this up, I've got a couple of messages in terms of links that are on the webinar here on the attachments bit. There's a bit to some upcoming webinars. Do come and join us again. And one to our YouTube channel. Obviously, if you subscribe to that, you'll get a message every time there's a video on, and that's videos from the event and obviously our webinars. So this one will be on there. This session will be available on demand almost instantly once we stop. So if there's any part of Niamh's presentation you want to go over again, any slide you want to have a look at again, a bit like the modern data stack, for example, at the end, and want to have another look at that, then you can do that straight away. Just do it on demand and obviously forward it to the bit that you are specifically interested in. I'm going to end with this nice question about Fivetran, actually, but I'm going to reword it slightly. So obviously you spend a lot of time dealing with customers in your role. What's the sort of overriding thing that people are happy with? What once they've used Fivetran and they're all everything's working, what's the big difference to their lives that you make rather than comparing it to different tools? Is it, sort of speed, accessibility, or time wastage, time savage? What would you say is the overriding emotion towards you?
Yeah, the data access, very, very quickly. You can set up one of those data connectors in 5 minutes, but also, if it's so easy to use, but that doesn't mean there's not complicated stuff going on under the hood. So it's easy to use, but also we do give the control for you to be able to, for example, set an assigned access level for that particular thing at quite a granular level. So we're taking away the complexity, but we're not taking away your control over it. And I think that's what people like the most about Fivetran, as well as the fact that it's just super reliable and can recover even if there's connection losses. We have like a self-healing part of our connectors, which means that you always have kind of guaranteed data integrity. We'll just pick up where we left off on our last sync, and then the schema migration piece that I mentioned before is obviously not something that many other people can handle. So peace of mind that your data is going into the right place at the right time, and giving access to the right people.
Perfect. Well, that seems like a nice place to leave it. If you've got more questions about Fivetran, obviously one of those links is to Fivetran's website. You'll also be able to see them at fantastic shows like Big Data London later in the year, and come and meet them in person and ask them some questions. Registration for Big Data London will be coming imminently, so keep your eyes on your inbox for that. It's been a pleasure, Niamh. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really enjoyed the presentation. Hope everyone at home enjoyed it. But big thank you to Niamh, and we'll see you all again soon. So thank you very much. And
thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.